The small village of Akpala was buzzing with joy the day Esther received her university admission letter. Her dream had come true, and the entire community celebrated with her. Esther was the first in her family to go to the university, and everyone knew how hard she had worked to get there. Her mother, Deaconess Grace, cried tears of joy as she held the admission letter in her hands. "God has done it, my child. Your late father would have been very proud of you," she exclaimed, pulling Esther into a tight hug. "You must never forget to thank God and stay prayerful. Remember, it is His grace that has brought you this far." Esther nodded with a bright smile. "I won't forget, Mama. I'll keep praying," she promised. In the corner of the room, Esther's auntie, her late father's younger sister, Madame Florence, watched silently. She forced a smile, but in her heart, she was far from happy. Her own children had tried and failed several times to gain admission to the university. Seeing Esther succeed reminded her of their failure, and it filled her with bitterness. Esther was not just hardworking, she was also very prayerful. She attended church with her mother regularly and never missed prayer meetings. People often talked about her faith and determination. "This girl will go far," they said, nodding in approval. Grace made sure her daughter understood the importance of God in her life. Every evening they prayed together, and Esther grew up knowing how powerful prayer could be. While others celebrated Esther's success, Madame Florence couldn't stop thinking about her own children. Her oldest son, James, had written the university entrance exams twice and failed. Her second child, Angela, had also tried and didn't make it. As people in the village congratulated Esther and praised Deaconess Grace for raising such a remarkable daughter, Madame Florence felt like a knife was being twisted in her heart. She began to harbor jealousy, but she kept her feelings hidden, for now. The weeks flew by as Esther prepared to leave for school. The church organized a special prayer session for her, and Deaconess Grace led the congregation in thanking God. Esther was grateful for everyone's support and promised to work hard and make them proud. The night before she left, Deaconess Grace called her into the small living room. "Esther," she said, holding her daughter's hands firmly, "life in the university is different. You will meet all kinds of people. Some will lead you closer to God and some will try to take you away from Him. Be careful, my child. Always pray." "I will, Mama," Esther replied. Her mother's words were comforting, but they also made her a little nervous. She knew she was stepping into a whole new world, but she was determined to stay focused. The day finally came for Esther to leave for school. The whole family escorted her to the park, where she boarded a bus to the city. Madame Florence was there too, her smile as fake as ever. "Good luck, my dear," she said, patting Esther on the back. "Make us proud." As the bus drove off, Deaconess Grace stood at the roadside, waving and silently praying for her daughter's safety. Esther sat by the window, looking out at the familiar roads of her village. She was excited about what lay ahead, but she also felt a pang of sadness leaving home. She whispered a quiet prayer, asking God to guide her in this new chapter of her life. When Esther arrived at the university, everything felt like a dream. The bustling city streets, the tall buildings, and the endless crowd of students were nothing like her quiet village. She clutched her bag tightly as she made her way to her hostel, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. That night, as she unpacked her belongings in the small shared room, Esther knelt by her bed and prayed. "Thank you, Lord, for bringing me here safely," she whispered. "Please help me to stay focused and make my family proud." In those early days, Esther held on to her faith tightly. She woke up early to pray, attended fellowship meetings, and even joined a small prayer group on campus. Her heart was full of gratitude to God for the opportunity to be in school, and she was determined to excel both in her studies and her faith. It didn't take long for Esther to meet new friends. Her roommates, Anita and Favor, were kind and lively girls who helped her adjust to university life. But unlike Esther, they weren't particularly interested in religion. They laughed and joked about almost everything, including people who were too churchy. At first, Esther politely declined their invitations to hang out. "I have fellowship meetings," she would say with a smile. But Anita would often roll her eyes. "Esther, don't you think you're overdoing it? University isn't a church camp, you know?" Favor chimed in one evening as Esther was heading out for a prayer meeting. "Come on, Esther. You're always praying. Relax for once." Let's watch a movie or go out and have some fun. Meet some handsome boys too." Their words started to sink in. Over time, Esther began to wonder if she was missing out. She had spent so many years focused on her studies and prayers that she had never really let herself have fun. Slowly, she started to give in to her friends' invitations. She skipped one fellowship meeting, then another, convincing herself it was just for a little break. As the weeks turned into months, Esther's routine began to change. Her early morning prayers became less frequent, and her Bible started to gather dust. She still believed in God, but her focus was shifting. Her friends teased her whenever she mentioned going back to fellowship. "You're too young to be acting like an old woman," Anita said one evening. "Live a little. You can always pray later." Esther laughed nervously, trying to hide her discomfort. Deep down, she felt guilty, but she didn't know how to explain it to her friends. She wanted to fit in, to belong, and to experience the excitement of university life like everyone else. Despite the laughter and new experiences, Esther couldn't shake the nagging feeling in her heart. At night, as she lay in bed, she would remember her mother's words. "Always pray. Never let anything take you away from God." Her mind would drift back to the evenings she spent praying with her mother and the nights when they sang worship songs together. A lump would form in her throat as she thought about how far she had drifted. But instead of reaching out to God, she buried those feelings, telling herself that she would get back on track eventually. Grace called Esther regularly, her voice filled with love and encouragement. "My dear, how are you doing? Are you keeping up with your prayers? Are you attending fellowship?" "Yes, Mama," Esther would answer, forcing a cheerful tone. "I'm doing fine." But her mother wasn't fooled. "Esther, don't let the world distract you from your faith. You're in that school because of God's grace. Stay close to Him, my child." Each call left Esther feeling conflicted. On the one hand, she wanted to make her mother proud, but on the other hand, she resented the constant reminders. "Doesn't she trust me to handle myself?" Esther thought. She started avoiding her mother's calls, letting them ring unanswered when she felt too guilty to talk. By the middle of the semester, Esther's life had changed drastically. She spent her evenings hanging out with friends instead of attending fellowship, and her weekends were filled with hangouts and parties. Yet despite all the fun, something felt missing. There was a hollowness she couldn't explain, a sense of unease that followed her wherever she went. One Sunday, as she walked past the campus chapel, she heard the faint sound of worship songs. For a moment she stopped and stared at the building, memories of her vibrant faith flooding back. But instead of going inside, she shook her head and walked away. "Maybe next time," she whispered to herself. Back in Akpala village, Madame Florence's heart was heavy with envy. As Esther's academic success became a topic of conversation among the villagers, Florence found it harder to hide her bitterness. "She is such a smart girl," one woman said during a market gathering. "Grace really raised her well. First in her family to go to university? That's no small thing." Florence forced a smile as she placed tomatoes into a basket. "Yes, it's good for her," she muttered, her voice tight, but inside her thoughts were anything but kind. Every praise for Esther felt like a slap in the face. Why hadn't her own children succeeded like that? James, her oldest son, had failed the university entrance exams 3 times now. People used to say good things about her children. But now, all they talked about was Esther. Even her closest friends had begun to make subtle remarks. "It's not easy when another person's child overshadows yours," one of them had said jokingly. Florence had laughed, but the words burned in her chest. Every time Florence passed Grace in the village, her fake smiles grew harder to maintain. Grace would always greet her warmly, oblivious to the storm of jealousy brewing inside her. One evening, Florence sat on her wooden chair, staring at the dim light of a kerosene lamp. Her thoughts were consumed by Esther. Why does she get to succeed while my children struggle? The question echoed in her mind until it became unbearable. "I've tried everything for my children," she muttered to herself. "Maybe it's time I take matters into my own hands." The idea that came to her was one she had never entertained before, but the bitterness in her heart overpowered her conscience. If Esther wasn't around to shine, people would stop comparing her children to her. Her decision was made. A few days later, Florence made her way to the outskirts of the village. where a man known as Baba Ejike lived. People whispered about his powers, saying he could make even the most impossible things happen, for a price. Florence had always avoided such things, but desperation had pushed her past her limits. The small mud hut where Baba Ejike lived was surrounded by thick bushes. A strange, heavy smell filled the air as Florence approached. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, but then she reminded herself why she was there. She knocked softly on the wooden door. "Come in," a raspy voice called. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a flickering candle. Baba Ejike sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by small clay pots and strange-looking charms. His eyes were sharp as if he could see straight through Florence. "What brings you here?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. Florence hesitated before speaking. "There's someone in my family," she began. "She's making life difficult for my children. Everyone talks about her like she's the only one who matters. I want her out of the way." Baba Ejike studied her for a moment before nodding. "It can be done," he said, "but there's always a price." Baba Ejike reached for a small bowl filled with dark powder and began to chant in a language Florence didn't understand. He threw the powder into the air, and the flame of the candle flared briefly before settling again. "She is traveling soon, isn't she?" he asked suddenly, his eyes narrowing. Florence nodded, surprised. "Yes, for Christmas. She'll be coming home from school." The spiritual leader smiled faintly. "Good. That's when we'll strike. The road is dangerous, especially for those who aren't properly protected. An accident will happen, and she will not make it back." Florence's heart surged with satisfaction. This was perfect. Accidents happened all the time on the dangerous village roads, and no one would suspect her. To her, this wasn't guilt-worthy. It was just a plan to level the playing field. As far as she was concerned, it was necessary. She felt nothing but relief at having found a solution. Baba Ejike handed her a small charm wrapped in red cloth. "Place this under your bed tonight," he instructed, "and bring me something that belongs to the girl, something personal." Florence nodded, clutching the charm tightly. She had no regrets. For the first time in weeks, she felt at peace. The plan was set, and soon Esther would no longer be the center of everyone's admiration. The semester had finally come to an end, and Esther was excited about returning home for Christmas. It had been months since she last saw her family, and she missed the comfort of home-cooked meals and the laughter of her younger siblings. However, her excitement was mixed with a twinge of guilt. She hadn't been as prayerful as she used to be, and her mother, Deaconess Grace, often reminded her over the phone to stay close to God. "Esther, you must pray," her mother said during their most recent call. "There's a heaviness in my spirit. Please, don't forget to cover yourself in prayer before your journey." "Yes, Mama," Esther replied impatiently. "I'll be fine. It's just a bus ride. Don't worry so much." Grace wasn't convinced. She had been feeling uneasy for weeks, sensing that something was wrong. She increased her prayer time, waking up earlier than usual to cry out to God for Esther's protection. "Lord, watch over my daughter," she prayed, tears streaming down her face. "Let no harm come to her." The day before Esther's trip, she received an unexpected message from James, the leader of the campus fellowship. He had always been kind to her, often encouraging her to return to the group whenever they crossed paths on campus. "Esther," his message read, "I had a bad dream about you last night. I saw you traveling home, but something terrible happened on the way. Please, if it's not necessary, consider postponing your journey. Pray about it." When Esther read the message, she rolled her eyes. "James and his dreams," she muttered to herself. "He's always so dramatic." Still, a small part of her felt uneasy. She thought about calling her mother to share the message, but she didn't want to hear another lecture about prayer. Instead, she shrugged it off, deciding that James was just being overzealous. Later that evening, he called her to emphasize his warning. "Esther, I'm serious. I believe God is trying to protect you from something. Please take this seriously." "Thanks for the concern, James," she said, trying to sound polite. "But I'll be fine. It's just a bus ride. Nothing will happen." James sighed. "At least pray about it," he said before hanging up. But Esther didn't pray. She was too busy packing her bags and catching up on her favorite series to think about it. Meanwhile, in the village, Auntie Florence was finalizing her plan. She had managed to get a handkerchief that Esther had left behind during her last visit and brought it to the spiritual leader. The man held the handkerchief and began chanting, his voice rising and falling in strange tones. Smoke filled the small hut as he threw herbs into a burning pot. "The girl will not reach her destination," he declared. "The road will claim her." Auntie Florence smiled wickedly. "It's about time," she muttered. "Now Grace will feel the pain she's caused me." The spiritual leader instructed her to remain patient. "The spirits will handle everything," he assured her. Back at home, Deaconess Grace couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter was in danger. That night, she knelt beside her bed, crying out to God with all her heart. "Lord, please protect Esther. Whatever the enemy has planned, let it fail. Cover her with your blood." Her prayers were long and filled with tears. She stayed on her knees until her voice was hoarse, refusing to let go of her faith. "I know you are a God who saves," she whispered, clutching her Bible. "Do not let my daughter fall into the hands of the enemy." The next morning, Grace called Esther again. "Esther, I know you're excited to come home, but please pray before you travel. I don't feel at peace." "Yes, Mama," Esther replied, her voice tinged with impatience. "You've said this 100 times already. I'll be fine." Grace paused, her heart heavy. "Promise me you'll pray before you get on that bus." "I promise," Esther said, though she had no intention of doing so. "Stop worrying so much." But Grace couldn't stop. She spent the rest of the day fasting and praying, pleading with God to watch over her child. Esther could hardly contain her excitement as she boarded the bus heading to her village. It had been months since she last saw her family, and the thought of spending Christmas at home filled her with joy. The passengers were a mix of young people like herself, chatting and laughing, and older adults, some silently reading or dozing off. As the bus left the city and sped onto the open highway, she gazed out the window, letting the hum of the engine lull her into a sense of calm. Her mind wandered to the food her mother would have prepared, the stories she would share with her siblings, and the long, peaceful nights she missed in the village. Back in the village, Auntie Florence was waiting. The ritual had been completed, and she felt certain that Esther would not survive the journey. The spiritual leader had warned her not to doubt the process. "The spirits have spoken," he said with finality. "It is done." As the bus approached a rest stop midway through the journey, strange things began to happen. First, a sudden and violent jolt startled everyone. As the bus sped along a quiet stretch of the highway, the atmosphere inside grew tense. Esther could feel it even if no one else seemed to notice. Suddenly, a loud honking sound pierced the air. The passengers turned their heads toward the source, a large truck swerving wildly into their lane. The driver slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The truck collided with the side of the bus, sending it spinning off the road. Screams filled the air as metal crunched and windows shattered. Esther felt herself being thrown forward, her head hitting the seat in front of her. When the bus finally came to a stop, it was a scene of chaos. The vehicle was mangled, lying at an awkward angle on the roadside. Injured passengers groaned in pain, some unconscious, others crying out for help. Esther lay still, dazed and bleeding from a cut on her forehead. Her vision blurred, and the last thing she remembered was the sound of sirens approaching. Back in the village, Auntie Florence heard the news before anyone else. A neighbor rushed to her house, breathless and wide-eyed. "Did you hear, Florence? There's been an accident on the highway. They say Esther's bus was involved." Florence's heart leapt with dark satisfaction. She forced a shocked expression, but inside she was giddy with triumph. "Oh, what a tragedy," she said, shaking her head for effect. But as soon as the neighbor left, she whispered to herself, "It's done. She's gone. Finally." She sat back in her chair, a wicked smile creeping across her face. Now Grace will know how it feels to lose everything. Grace, however, felt a sudden, inexplicable heaviness in her spirit. She was in the middle of preparing dinner when she stopped, clutching her chest. "Something's wrong," she whispered. She knelt down immediately, tears streaming down her face as she prayed. "Lord, I don't know what's happening, but I trust you. Protect my daughter. Let no harm come to her." Moments later, a neighbor came running to her house, shouting her name. "Deaconess Grace! Deaconess Grace!" There's been an accident on the highway, Esther's bus. Grace's heart sank, but she refused to give in to fear. God, you promised me, she whispered as she grabbed her scarf and headed out the door. You will not fail me. At the hospital, Grace arrived to find a crowd of injured passengers being rushed in. Her eyes scanned every face frantically, searching for her daughter. Finally, she spotted Esther being wheeled in on a stretcher, her face pale but alive. Thank you, Lord, Grace sobbed, falling to her knees right there in the hospital corridor. You are faithful. Esther was discharged from the hospital 2 days after the accident. Though she had a bandage on her head and bruises on her arms, she was grateful to be alive. She couldn't stop thinking about how close she had come to losing her life. Every time she closed her eyes, the sound of the crash replayed in her mind. The screams, the chaos, the fear. Her mother, Deaconess Grace, had stayed by her side through it all. God saved you for a reason, Esther, she said, holding her daughter's hand as they left the hospital. The enemy had a plan, but God's plan is greater. Back at home, Grace wasted no time. She gathered women from the church and organized an all-night prayer meeting to thank God and disrupt whatever evil plans the enemy still had in store. That night, the small living room was filled with voices lifted in prayer and worship. The women sang songs of praise, their voices echoing into the night. Grace led the prayers, her voice steady and full of authority. Lord, expose the works of darkness. Let every evil plot return to its sender. As they prayed, a sense of peace filled the room. Grace felt a deep assurance that God was working. By the time the prayers ended in the early hours of the morning, she was certain that the battle had been won. Meanwhile, in her small hut, Auntie Florence was restless. She had been celebrating what she thought was Esther's demise, but something didn't feel right. She hadn't heard any confirmation of Esther's death, and her nerves were beginning to fray. Late that night, the spiritual leader she had consulted paid her a visit. His face was dark with anger, and his voice was sharp. "Woman, what have you done?" he demanded. "What do you mean?" Florence asked, startled. "The ritual has backfired," he shouted angrily. "The girl is not dead. There is a higher power protecting her." Florence's heart sank. "No, this can't be," she cried. "You said the ritual would work." "You underestimated the power of prayer," he said bitterly. "Your sister-in-law's prayers have covered her daughter. Now you must face the consequences." Before Florence could respond, he turned and left, leaving her to face the weight of her actions. The next morning, Grace sat Esther down in their living room. "Esther," she began, "God saved your life for a reason. Do you see now why I've always told you to pray? The enemy doesn't rest, but we serve a God who never fails." Tears filled Esther's eyes. "Mama, I see it now. I've been so foolish. I ignored your warnings, I ignored God, and I almost lost my life because of it." "It's not too late, my child," Grace said, pulling her into a hug. "You can start over. God is merciful." That night, Esther knelt by her bed for the first time in months. With tears streaming down her face, she rededicated her life to God. "Lord, I'm sorry," she whispered. "Thank you for saving me. Help me to live for you again." When Esther returned to the university after the holidays, she had a new sense of purpose. She shared her story with her friends and peers, telling them about the accident and how God had spared her life. Her testimony resonated with many. Even some of her skeptical friends began to ask questions about faith and prayer. Esther rejoined the campus fellowship, and this time, she was fully committed. James, the fellowship leader, smiled when he saw her at the next meeting. "Welcome back, Esther," he said warmly. "We've missed you." Esther nodded, her heart full of gratitude. "I miss this too," she said, "and I'll never take it for granted again." Back in the village, Florence couldn't bear the guilt any longer. The whispers of her neighbors and the weight of her exposed actions pushed her to seek forgiveness. She had also realized that the power of God is higher than any power she could imagine. One Sunday, she walked into the church where Grace was praying. Falling to her knees before the congregation, she confessed everything. "I was wrong," she sobbed. "I let envy blind me, and I almost destroyed my own family." Grace, though hurt, chose to forgive her. "We all make mistakes," she said, "but God's mercy is greater than our sins." Auntie Florence decided to give her life to Christ during the altar call. From that day, she no longer envied her niece and prayed for favor for her children instead. From that day on, Esther's life became a testimony of God's protection and grace. She lived with a renewed faith, inspiring others with her story. The accident that nearly claimed her life became a turning point, reminding her and everyone around her of the power of prayer and the importance of staying close to God.